Let's get started with class. This morning we're in Mark chapter 12. We are in Mark chapter 12. We'll have coffee tomorrow morning and we'll do Mark chapter 13. And so if you want to cover Mark chapter 13 with us, we'll be in the fellowship hall at 6:30. And you're welcome to come get coffee with us. I will be with you for this class and the next. And then Caleb Colquitt's going to take Mark 15 and 16. Because I will be with the college group. And so I've got this one and the next one. And so my time with you has almost come to an end. But for the time being, we will cover Mark chapter 12. For some context, let's remember where we're at. In Mark chapter 11, looking toward verses 27 through about 33, we had the day after the clearing of the temple. And so the scribes and the high priests and the elders, they came to Jesus, and they're upset with him because they say that Jesus has rebelled against their authority. And technically he has, right? He went into the temple and he cleared out everything that they've set into place. And so technically he did. Does that make them right? No, not at all. And so Jesus, when they ask, who gave you the authority to go and rebel against us? Jesus says, let me ask you this question first. Was the baptism of John from heaven or not? And they don't want to answer because either way, they're kind of in a pickle. Now, either way, they kind of look like fools. And so they just say, we're not really sure. We're not going to answer. And so Jesus says, I'm not going to answer you either. And so that's where we're at in Mark chapter 12. Jesus has just had this interaction where these men, all of those who make up the Sanhedrin, come to Jesus and they accuse him of rebelling against their authority. And Jesus, knowing where his authority comes from very well, refuses to answer them because neither side will answer the question at hand. So, we're in Mark chapter 12. That's just happened. They have refused to answer Jesus' question. And we get into verse 1. So this is Jesus' response. We're in the same conversation. He says, and he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and put a wall around it, and dug a vat under the winepress and built a tower and rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey. So there's a few things here. Though the chapter changes, it's important to remember the conversation remains the same. Jesus begins to say a parable to them. He says, you don't want to answer my question? Okay, let me tell you this parable. And typically with a parable that Jesus tells, it just has one main point. And if you overanalyze it, then you start getting into the weeds where Jesus didn't mean for you to go. There's one main thing that you need to know that you can probably figure out based on the whole conversation at hand and the context around it. Well, in this one, there's actually a few different components involved that Jesus makes pretty clear for us that makes this a much more pointed parable than I think we may see in some of the others that may just describe the kingdom of heaven and what this aspect of it is like and this aspect of it. Well, this one is very pointed, and it's important in the conversation. So, let me ask this, just so that we can stay fresh on why Jesus does some things. Why does Jesus speak in parables to the Pharisees? What do you remember maybe earlier in the book, or just what you already know about why Jesus would speak in parables, especially to Pharisees? Yeah, so part of it is that's just how maybe teachers would try to express something, is through a parable. That's true. But what else? Exactly. Right. So I put that up on the screen for you, Mark chapter 4, verses 10 through 12 over there by the word parables. Because in that, we get the purpose of parables. Jesus says in Mark chapter 4, verses 10 through 12, that there are some secrets in the kingdom that are to remain a secret for those who basically are blind and deaf, who are not actually seeking truth. They're just trying to manipulate, and they're just trying to learn so that they can attack Jesus. And they don't really care about seeking the truth. And so Jesus is going to speak in some parables. And if you really want to figure it out, you'll figure it out. And so I think that it's important to remember just constantly reminding ourselves of why Jesus is doing what he's doing, because he's intentional and strategic in everything he does. So, to understand this parable, we've got to look at some context around it. And so let's first look at some historical context. Much of the upper Jordan Valley and the Galilean upland, just a lot of land basically around here, was bought by wealthy foreign landlords. And so this is kind of a common idea that a bunch of wealthy guys who don't really live here are going to buy land, and then they're going to get landless peasants, people who just don't have a home maybe, or people who are just vineyard farmers and they like to do this. I don't tenant farmers. These wealthy people would hire these farmers, these tenant farmers, onto their land, say, you can live here if you'd like, you can work for me, but whatever you make, this percentage or portion of the produce is going to come back to me. And I'll send a person to come get it, you give it to that person, and they'll bring it back, or something along those lines. They would typically have a contract to say all of these things. And so these tenant farmers, or how does it say in this, vine growers, would stay on the land, and they'd be hired by the landlord to take care of the landowner's estate. So farmers would use these rough stone walls, and this is why he goes into detail about some walls and hedges and such. Farmers would use rough stone walls or hedges to keep away animals or predators. They'd have watchtowers, maybe for guards. They would kind of just usually look like huts with just a flat roof on it. But these are all usual components in a farm. Jesus is just trying to kind of telling a story. But Jesus is also saying these things with a bigger theological scope in mind, as is typically the case with a parable. And so you may notice in your Bible that if you look at verse 1, you're not going to really see on the screen because it's all the same font. But if you look in your Bible, at least in mine, from the word planted and onward through the word tower is all capitalized, meaning that it's coming from a different text or a different verse, right? And of course, when Jesus is saying these things, it's not like he's got subtitles that are putting it in a different text or whatever. But we can see that there's probably a reason that he's saying these, because our Bibles kind of gives us this little hint, right? And so if you look in Isaiah chapter 5, we see that what Jesus is saying and what he's about to continue saying is rooted in what we see in Isaiah chapter 5. And we're going to stay on this for a little while. As we go through this text, we'll point out how it correlates back to Isaiah 5. But in Isaiah 5, verses 1 through 7, it describes the nation of Israel as God's vineyard, where he dug all around it, removed its stones, and planted it with the choicest vine. And he built a tower in the middle of it, and he also hewed out a wine vat in it. Then he expected it to produce good grapes, but it produced only worthless ones. And I think that's verses 3 and 4 or 4 and 5, something along those lines that I was just quoting or reading. So though we read these words and see a difference, we can see in our text, the Sanhedrin, his audience, the people that are there listening to this, they would have to recognize, these words come from Isaiah 5. Everything that he's saying is kind of rooted in Isaiah 5, and they would know that, and we're going to see that they're going to know that a little bit later on. But so the question is, why? Why does Jesus do this? What is Jesus trying to express by using Isaiah 5 as kind of a skeleton for what he's saying now? And so let's continue reading, and we'll figure it out. Verses 2 through 5. At the harvest time, he sent a slave to the vine grower. So verse 1, we have a wealthy person who built a farm. He's hiring people to live on the farm. All right, verse 2. At the harvest time, he sent a slave to the vine growers in order to receive some of the produce of the vineyard from the vine growers. They took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again, he sent them another slave, and they wounded him in the head and treated him shamefully. And he sent another, and that one they killed. And so with many others, beating some and killing others. So in our story, we have the landowner who sends his servants to pick up the produce. This was what would customarily happen. If you were a tenant farmer, you grow some things in this landowner's farm, and then you give him what he is owed as his land. And so this landowner sends his servant to go collect what was earned by the tenant farmers, which is kind of just their rent for being there. And we read this, and we kind of think, at least I do, like this is kind of ridiculous. Like the hostility that these servants are facing is kind of insane. Like, why are these people so mad? But just throughout some reading, I learned that this is not necessarily an unheard of occurrence. Like, this is not just like why would this ever happen? Like, hard for me to fathom. They may have heard of a story like this. Tenant farmers could hold back. They could if they wanted to. Not that this was ethical or within their contract, but they could hold back some of what was contractually owed, like what they were supposed to pay to the landowner, if it was within their own best interest, or if they were trying to rebel against the landowner. And so there's this like parchment or papyrus or whatever that kind of shows a story like this happening in Galilee in a farm, where it's not like in the Bible or anything, but it's just a separate story from history where something like this has happened. And so this isn't just like like this has never happened before and Jesus just making up some preposterous story. It's also important to point out that murder of an unarmed messenger would be seen as treachery in this time as for this culture. If you have an unarmed messenger come in and you murder him, this is a big deal. And so it's very possible that as Jesus is talking about these messengers being unjustly murdered, that the listeners might think about Israel's tradition of murdering and persecuting Israel's prophets. And this is why I think. Prophets are often called the servants of God. I think I had that listed on the screen of multiple verses if that's the case. And this is a very highlighted part of Jewish tradition, the fact that they persecuted their prophets. You see that in Matthew 5:12, that Jesus brings it up, kind of just talking about when the people of the kingdom are being persecuted, and says, just like the prophets. And he doesn't really have to elaborate that much because everybody knows that God's prophets throughout history have been persecuted by Israel. And so this is not an unheard of idea. So it's very possible that as they're telling this story, they know that this is a parable, and they know that things represent other things, that they could think, well, maybe this is about the prophets. So we continue on. Verse 6. Oh, I forgot to have my cool transitions on these. Verse 6. He had one more to send, a beloved son. He sent him last of all to them, saying, they will respect my son. But those vine growers said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. They took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. So this landowner, after all these servants have died, says, you know what? Maybe if I send my son, my own beloved son, that they won't kill him. Maybe they will show gentleness, though they haven't at all so far. And it seems a bit naive. Speaking practically, it seems a bit naive to say, well, they've been pretty terrible to my servants so far, but maybe they'll be nice to my own son. And what we read is that's obviously not the case. So this beloved son, this might be words that are familiar to you because the Father has already called Jesus his beloved son twice in this book. In Mark 1:11 when he's baptized, and in Mark 9:7 on the Mount of Transfiguration. And so Jesus portrays this landowner as a guy who thinks that his beloved son will be shown gentleness. And this thought, I think, as we've discussed, it represents the son's own commission from the Father, not that the Father was naive at all in sending Jesus, but that God himself, the Father, is gentle and he's lovingly persistent. He's going to keep sending people even if it comes to his own son. And so that's kind of what the idea that's being portrayed here, I think, is the landowner he's running out of servants. He's going to send his own son. And maybe these people will be good to him. But the tenant farmers see the son, and they think, oh, maybe the father's dead. Maybe we have a claim to this land now. And so they thought that they could claim, which was possible, that they could claim this ownerless property. And so if a property just didn't have anyone that was owning it or claiming it, then you could claim it if you were on it. Back then, that is something that could happen. And so in their minds, they're thinking, okay, well, if the son's coming, father must be dead. And if we kill this son, nobody owns this property and nobody can claim it. So they say, well, here's the son. Let's take his inheritance. This land belongs to him technically, but if we kill him, We can take it. And so not only do they kill him, but they disrespect the son by not giving him a proper burial. They just kind of toss him outside. They don't care. They just want the land. And so if you're Jesus' listener right now, you might be thinking these guys are delusional. Because what judge in their right mind is going to allow a group of men to murder multiple people and the son of the land so that they could actually claim the property? That's ridiculous. No judge is that unjust in this time. Like, that's just not how this works. And so they're not going to let all these men just murder these people and claim the land. And so if you're a person listening to this, you're thinking he's emphasizing how delusional this is. How crazy it is to think that you can kill all these people and still think you have a right to the land. No, you're going to jail. You're being punished. Oh, and this time, you're going to die for your actions. So we get into verse 9. After this whole story, Jesus asks, what will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the vine growers and will give the vineyard to others. So Jesus takes words similar to what is found in Isaiah 5:5, what God is going to do to the vineyard of Israel, to show that the owner of the vineyard is going to destroy what's there. In Isaiah 5:5, Isaiah is writing as though the vineyard, all of Israel, is at fault. That's how Isaiah is writing. Now there's a distinction here in that what Jesus is talking about is not the vineyard being at fault, but the people who are tending to it. Only the tenant farmers are at fault in this story, not the vineyard itself. And that's how it's different than Isaiah. And I think this is pointing toward these religious leaders. They're the ones who are working in this land here, in this vineyard, and they have ruined it. They think that they can claim it as their own when it's not theirs at all. And remember, we're going back to chapter 11 when they say, by what authority did you think that you could do something to the temple, to our temple? And Jesus, although this is not explicitly stated, kind of has to ask, well, where do you think I get my authority from? Was the baptism of John from heaven or not? Because if you say yes, you have to say my authority is from heaven as well. He's kind of saying, this is my Father's house. I have the authority to do this. You have none. And then he tells this story about a bunch of men who are trying to claim land that isn't theirs. And they're being unjust in doing so. It's not the vineyard's fault, like in Isaiah, it's those who are farming on it. And so they've rejected John and Jesus, and consequently God in doing so. And Jesus implies here, without explicitly stating, that the Sanhedrin has rejected God's final messenger. And now the punishment's going to come. You have rejected the beloved Son, and so now you're going to be punished. The inheritance is no longer theirs, but instead those who are in the new Israel, which is an idea that we get in Romans. So we'll move on to verses 10 through 11. He says this, have you not even read the scripture? The stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone. This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. So he uses Psalm 118, verse 22, to confirm, Jesus does, that Jesus is the Son in the parable, and that the Sanhedrin has rejected him. It says the stone himself, which the builders rejected, this is the one that's going to be the chief cornerstone. He says that's me, and you've rejected me. And it also compares his current, this verse does, I think it kind of compares his current despised and rejected status with the glorious exaltation that is to come. Here pretty soon, he's going to be that chief cornerstone. And he will be marvelous in our eyes. And so we get to verse 12, and this is the Sanhedrin's response. And they were seeking to seize him, and yet they feared the people, for they understood that he spoke the parable against them. And so they left him and went far away, and went away. Well, why is the Sanhedrin mad? Because Jesus, in the form of a parable, has portrayed them in this parable as delusional and sinful criminals who are farming on someone else's farm. It's not theirs, and they don't have the authority. And Jesus uses Isaiah to tell them that they're working in God's vineyard, but they've rejected his act of gentleness in sending his own son. And now they're going to face punishment for it. This shows just how significant their non-answer or their rejection was in just the chapter before, when they wouldn't respond to Jesus' question. Jesus says, you want to completely reject the authority of the Father. You want to reject my authority? Okay, well, this was the last straw here. This was the final punishment is coming because you have constantly rejected the messengers that God has sent, including his own son. So yeah, because of Jesus' popularity, they left him. And I imagine that they left him just steaming in anger. And they can't do anything about it because Jesus is so popular that they know that the people would uproar and that they'd be in trouble with the Romans if they allowed this to happen. And so we'll get into verse 13. And from verses 13 and on, we get a bunch of questions. Question after question of people that are challenging Jesus until I think about the last one. People who are challenging Jesus and confronting him, trying to cause controversy, trying to poke holes in what Jesus thinks he knows. And what we're going to see is Jesus' intentionality and his strategy and how quickly he is to be able to think on his feet and respond in what just seems to be the perfect way. And so we get in verse 13 is question number 1. Well, the beginning to question number 1. Then they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to him in order to trap him in a statement. Now, if you'll remember, the Pharisees and the Herodians in chapter 3, verse 6. This is way on back. Week like 3 or 4. But in chapter 3, verse 6, the Pharisees and the Herodians hear about Jesus. And they're upset with what he's doing, with what he's teaching. And it says that they're going to plot to kill him. And they're going to devise a plan. And so here we are, many chapters later, and Jesus is in Jerusalem. This was in his Galilean ministry, early on in his Galilean ministry, that they're thinking, we got to find a way to kill this guy. We got to get rid of him. Well, here they are, and they've devised this plan to trap him. It's like they took him, how many chapters is this, like 11? I'm not going to think about it anymore, but that might be bad math. But about 11 chapters to figure out, this is my plan, now let's enact it. So, verse 14, this is what they're going to do. They say, they came and said to him, Teacher, we know that you are truthful and defer to no one, for you are not partial to any, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful to pay a poll tax to Caesar or not? In the beginning of verse 15, it continues the question by saying, shall we pay or shall we not pay? Now, a question for you is, why do you think that they say all of these things about Jesus before they ask the question? Why do they say that Jesus is truthful and he's not partial and all these other things? How so? Absolutely. Absolutely. That's probably an element of it too. That's true. I hadn't thought about that. So both ideas, this is definitely the most obvious one. It's like we know, reading it, they're not sincere. Like we saw in chapter 3, verse 6, where they're trying to trap Jesus. Jesus is no ignorant person either. He's going to point out this here in a second. But they're obviously hypocrites. They don't actually think this. They're just saying it. But there is an element, I think, that's totally fair of there's probably a lot of people around listening, and they don't want to just appear like they're attacking Jesus. They can't. People are going to be upset with them. And so instead they say, hey, Jesus, we know that you're truthful. We know that you're not partial. We know that you teach the way of God, and so please just teach us in truth. Let me ask you this really heated question that everybody is going to be upset with any answer that you give. That's ridiculous. And so we know that, but it does help to kind of portray themselves as, oh, Jesus, we really respect you. Question. And so I think that's true. Their description of him as impartial and only caring about the way of truth from God rather than the ways of man, it causes Jesus, I think, to have to face the question head on. If they're really hostile to Jesus and they say, Jesus, we can't stand you and blah, blah, we don't like what you've been doing here. We don't like these words. Let me ask you this question. I think Jesus, in front of all these people, has much more of a right to say, I don't want to answer this. You just showed me exactly where you stand. But instead, now that they've kind of buttered him up a little bit, then it's like, for the sake of the crowd, Jesus kind of has to answer head on. And not only that, but now these guys have given him a dilemma. They didn't ask this open-ended question of, what do you think about Caesar's taxes? Like how we would talk about the water coolers. Like, hey, what do you think about these taxes? It's crazy. They don't ask it like that. They say, should we pay taxes or not? Those are the two options, and that's strategic. Because it's not simply a question of ethics, but it's a question of emotion, and it's a question of religion. And there's a lot of different aspects that are tied up in this question. As the tax for the tribute money, as it came down from Roman authorities, there were a lot of different reactions, and people fell in different camps. You've got Jewish zealots who refused to pay the taxes. In fact, I think you've got some zealots in Jesus' 12 who were so adamantly against Rome and the authority above them that they weren't going to pay any taxes. And so then you have the Pharisees who were embarrassed. They didn't want to pay these taxes from Rome, but they accepted it, and they were going to do it, but they certainly didn't want to, and they were kind of embarrassed by it. And so then you've got the Herodians, who they're going to accept it by principle because they like Herod. They like Rome. They're benefiting from them. And so they're cool with the taxes. And so the Pharisees, by asking this question, are probably more concerned with the moral and the religious implications, or the results, I guess, of giving money to Rome. Morally and religiously, are you going to say that that's okay, Jesus? Well, then on the opposite side, which makes it funny that the Pharisees and the Herodians are working together on this, because you have the Pharisees and the Pharisees who are against this based on religion and morality. They don't like that they have to pay these taxes to Rome. Well, then you have the Herodians on the complete other side who disagree. The only thing that they agree on is they don't like Jesus. And they disagree, and they say, we want to know what Jesus says based on politics and nationality. We want to know, are you going to rebel against authority? And so the goal of the question is either Jesus says, yes, you have to pay your taxes, and he upsets everyone, especially Jews, who are going to fall in this Pharisees camp of we don't want to pay taxes. I feel like it goes against our morals. It goes against our religion. But then if he says, no, you don't have to pay taxes, pay to God, pay to Yahweh instead. Well, then you have all these Herodians who are going to say, oh, you're going to rebel against authority. You're going to rebel against the government. Okay. And then Jesus gets arrested for that. And so what does Jesus say? How do you respond in this kind of situation? If people come up to me like that, I have no idea. I realize my situation. I'm in trouble. And so I wouldn't know what to say. But what does Jesus say? Starting in the middle of verse 15. But he, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, why are you testing me? Bring me a denarius to look at. And they brought one. And he said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? And they said to him, Caesar's. And Jesus said to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they were amazed at this. So let's go through this. Immediately, Jesus recognizes that this question's a trap. And honestly, I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to find it out, to figure that out. But Jesus notices right there in the moment, this is a trap, and he recognizes their hostility. But it doesn't stop him from responding. And so Jesus recognizes Caesar's image on the coin. And he notes that the authority of the governmental figure on the coin. And then Jesus also recognizes that it is within his right, Caesar's, to tax people. And paying that tax does not infringe on God's expectation of his people. You see in Romans chapter 13, 1 through 7, and 1 Timothy 2, and Titus 3, and 1 Peter 2, multiple times it talks about the person of God and his or her relationship with the government. And it's within the governmental figure's right to tax and God's people's right to pay. It doesn't infringe, I guess, on God's expectation for his people. But Jesus also makes a sharp distinction between Caesar and God. And he's showing that they're not the same. He says, you render to Caesar all things that are Caesar's, but God's all things that are God's. And they're not the same people. even though sometimes Roman governmental figures might consider themselves to be, but they're not gods. And so Jesus says, look, these are not the same. They're different authorities. And Caesar is not to be worshipped. However, though the duties between how you owe Caesar and how you owe God are different, Jesus shows that they're not completely opposite either. You can be under both authoritative figures and serve both of them adequately and well. Both sets of duties, because you fall under the same authority here, two different authority figures that you can obey at the same time. Both sets of duties are unified and ruled by the higher principle of achieving God's will. That's what Romans 13 talks about, right? When God puts someone into a place of authority like this, well, God's going to have His will done, no matter what, right? And so because man is made in God's image, we owe our total allegiance to God and who God gives authority to. And so that's what Jesus gets at here, is that you can serve God and you can pay to Caesar, because both are authoritative figures that we are supposed to obey. Obviously, one greater than the other. We're very aware of this. But from how Jesus has to address this question, he has to point out that we can obey both. And so he handles this really well. I don't think that I could say anything better. I couldn't, if you gave me 2 days, I don't think I could have thought of a better answer than this, certainly not on the spot. So let me get into question number 2. Even though I think that I'm about to have question number 3 come up on the slide, you can just ignore that. Question number 2, verse 18. Some Sadducees, who say that there is no resurrection, came to Jesus and began questioning him, saying. So let's talk about Sadducees first, before we get into what they're saying. Sadducees are Jewish aristocrats who are typically the families of high priests or wealthy, powerful Jews. They're the most wealthy and sophisticated class of Jews. And it's important to note that they only accepted the Pentateuch, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, as authoritative. And they rejected all oral tradition, which is typically how things were passed down from generation to generation and from person to person during this time. They rejected all of that just for the Pentateuch, or the Torah. Another thing that's important to point out that Mark does for us, we don't even have to do any digging for this, they don't believe in the resurrection, which sets them against the Pharisees and the common Jews who are very aware of what the resurrection is. In fact, it's obvious that just Jews in general, people at this time, were aware that there was a resurrection to come. But the Sadducees don't believe that because they only believe in the Pentateuch, and they don't see anything in the Pentateuch that talks about the resurrection. No reason to, and so they just don't believe in it. So a couple of notes. One, it's interesting to note that the resurrection was a popular part of Jewish tradition. This was not an unheard of idea. And the Sadducees just couldn't deduce the possibility of a resurrection from the Pentateuch. Note number 2. And we're stepping outside of the narrative for a second to look at just the book of Mark as a whole. The fact that Mark felt it necessary to explain that the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection seems to support, like, his audience is not Jewish. If his audience was Jewish, if they were familiar with the temple where the Sadducees typically were, they'd probably know that the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. And so that's another reason, and we talked about this in our intro class, but this is another reason to assume that Mark's probably writing to maybe people in Rome, the church in Rome, or at least the church that is not Jewish, but is most likely it's the church in Rome. Okay. Question number 3, and this is the question. They say, Teacher, Moses wrote for us, remember, because they only read the Torah and they only think that's authoritative. Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves behind a wife and leaves no child, his brother should marry the wife and raise up children to his brother. And so then they tell us this story, and they say, there were 7 brothers, and the first took a wife and died, leaving no children. The second one married her and died, leaving behind no children, and the third likewise. And so all 7 left no children. Last of all, the woman died also. In the resurrection, which they don't believe in, when they rise again, which one's wife will she be? For all 7 had married her. And I imagine that they come to Jesus with this question like, we got a good one for you, Jesus. And then they ask this hypothetical scenario that's like, theoretically, yes, this could happen. Is it likely? Probably not. Have you ever gotten those questions before, especially from people who may disagree with you on something about your beliefs? And they say, you know what, let me ask you this ridiculous question so that I could point out the flaws and you think, this is never going to happen. Why would you ask me this? It's never going to happen. I feel like this is kind of how this story goes. And so the Sadducees, they're quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 and 6. This is called the Levirate Law, and basically it says exactly what these Sadducees said. It protects the widow and the family bloodline by saying if your brother gets married and he has no children, you marry, and he dies, you marry his wife, so that the widow is taken care of and the family bloodline is continued. This is a big deal. And it's an act of kindness and mercy that is instilled in the law here. And so the Sadducees take this idea and then they present this story, which is likely inspired by several stories found in the book of Tobit, to challenge the validity of the resurrection. They say, okay, we're going to say that there's a resurrection here. Well, what about this? Who is this woman going to be married to in the resurrection? And so this is what Jesus says. I kind of chuckle at it because I really don't know. I guess that they were just so enamored and filled by like their own culture and whatever that they thought that everybody was going to be married in heaven. And so they were like, oh, this is going to be a huge problem. I don't know, but I just don't see the problem really here. So it kind of makes me chuckle. Verse 24. Jesus said to them, is this not the reason you are mistaken? That you do not understand the Scriptures or the power of God? Which, let me stop there. This actually might be a response that I would give. Have you just not read the Bible? But anyways, continue on. Verse 25. For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And so Jesus' response, it contains two questions and two positive statements. And so the first question points toward their lack of understanding in both the Scriptures and God, which is kind of humorous considering these people were very highly educated and they were very literate, and they probably would have taken very high offense to this. But it shows that they were mistaken with what resurrection life would be like, in assuming that it'd be similar to life here on earth. So Jesus says we're going to be like the angels in heaven, and most Jewish people are going to agree that the angels are not married. There's no need to be married in heaven. You're in the presence of God. Why would you need a helpmeet? Why would you have any needs? You're in heaven. And so most of them are going to agree with that. So we get to verse 26. And Jesus continues on, but regarding the fact that the dead rise again, have you not read the book of Moses? In the passage about the burning bush, how God spoke to him, saying, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are greatly mistaken. Now let me ask you this, and then we're going to get into something that hopefully I have time to finish. What helps Jesus in his response? Right here. When you read this, now you've got to think, I'm responding to Sadducees. They don't believe in the resurrection. They're all very rich, wealthy, educated people, and they only believe in the Pentateuch. What does Jesus do strategically here that you see that helps his case? There you go. There's only one place here that they have common ground to quote from, and that's the Torah, the Pentateuch. So Jesus says, look, I could take you to probably some other places, and I could show you some other things, but you know what? I'll work on your grounds. I'll strip away everything that I know to be true, and I'll talk just about what we can agree on, and I'll still prove you wrong. I'll still prove me right. And that's an idea or a strategy that we can certainly take from, that I think Jesus does here, is he finds the common ground, and that's what he goes with, though he might even could build a stronger case elsewhere. He does it here. And so he uses the Pentateuch. And so he uses Exodus chapter 3, verse 6. And he doesn't really use Exodus chapter 3, verse 6 to prove the resurrection, because it's just not there, right? Exodus chapter 3, verse 6, he just says, I'm the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. And so nobody's really going to look at this and think about the resurrection necessarily. But what he is doing, you can kind of see it and understand it because of when you read the whole conversation, which is what we've done up to this point. And so in Exodus chapter 3, verse 6, he's using it to show that God is, I think, he's using it to show that God is our helper and he's our Savior and he provides redemption. And we can know this based on some of the grammar used in the text, specifically the phrase, the God of. And there's a lot that we could talk about and read that I didn't feel it necessary to really bring up about some of their prayers, like Jews, how they would pray and how they would use the phrase, the God of. But I felt like we could make this point just on the text. We see this formulation of words, the God of, in Exodus chapter 3, verse 6, 15, 16, and in chapter 4, verse 5. And these are all verses that point toward God promising salvation and deliverance to his people. All of them are. And so this formulation of words, based on, I think, that alone, but also the fact that Jews would use this in prayers and in festivals very intentionally and specifically, this formulation of words serves to guarantee deliverance for God's people because of God's character. We're talking about who God is. God is the God of this and of that and of this. And just looking in the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you could see how God has delivered, he's redeemed, and he's promised them salvation. And so in this case, I think Jesus uses this verse containing this formulation of words to point to the fact that God delivers and redeems his people. And would it not be contradictory for God to guarantee deliverance to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and yet when they die, they're immediately extinct, which is what the Sadducees thought would happen. They thought you just die and then you're dead, you're extinct, and that's it. Would it not be contradictory for God to claim, I'm going to deliver you and redeem you and save you, and then when you die, nothing else happens? It's over. Of course, that would be contradictory. And so I think this is why God is described as not the God of the dead, but the God of the living, because their souls are not extinct forever. God is powerful, and he's faithful to his promises, and he's promised to deliver his people, and he shows that even in the Pentateuch, the only 5 books that the Sadducees agreed with. Okay, we will have to be done for now, and so we might pick up here tomorrow, or we might not. We'll see. And so we'll have coffee tomorrow at 6:30.